So good evening, everyone, and I thank you for joining us for this book discussion on Life Interrupted, Understanding India's Suicide Crisis by Amrita Tripathi, who's not here with us, Abhijit Nadkarni on my right, and Sumitra Pathare on my left. A very quick introduction of the two co-authors, or two of the three co-authors who are here with us today. Dr. Abhijit Nadkarni is Associate Professor of Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, UK. And he's also the co-director of the Addictions Research Group at Sangat in Goa, India. Dr. Sumitra Pathare is a consultant psychiatrist and the director of the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy, Indian Law Society, Pune. Thank you both for joining us. Now, among the many public health issues which have emerged as terribly important over the last say 2 decades or so, or maybe the past 3 decades. Couple of them do not receive as much attention as they should, I think. And one of them, which has always bothered me, is road accidents, other than suicides. Road accidents simply go under the radar. I mean, every now and then, even in Goa, you pick up the newspaper and you find that, two-wheelers especially, but also worldwide. I mean, road accidents are a huge public health problem. I remember that in Brazil it was a huge public health problem, road accidents and shooting deaths. Again, in the United States, Brazil. So these are relatively neglected public health issues. And the book, Life Interrupted, what's great about it is that it deals with the subject of suicides, a very difficult subject, neglected subject, in a language which is extremely accessible. There's a wealth of information, all very succinctly put, summarized very, very well. And you can sort of rely on the information there because it is by people who understand mental health, who understand the problem of growing number of suicides in India and elsewhere around the world. Now, road accidents, suicides, they account for a large number of deaths worldwide. And I think it is to your credit that you have really put together a book which I hope gets translated into every Indian language. I mean, I honestly, going through the book, I realized that this is a book that needs to be translated as quickly as possible in as many languages as possible. I mean, work it out with your publisher. Please do it, because it can be, even the English edition is, I think, about 400 rupees. The translated editions, whatever the cost of translation, I think this is a book which needs to be read by everyone. Now, let me begin with the first question, which is somewhat obvious one and from the early chapters, which is there's a stigma attached to the term suicide. When you say, suicide kar liya, ye kar liya, wo, then you say ki must be somebody of weak mental character, or it is somebody who has certain disease. Mental health is seldom acknowledged as a health problem to begin with, and suicide or attempted suicide, उसने कोशिश करी, वो ऐसा है, बहुत frustrated her life से, and all that, all those things we say about people who commit suicide or attempt suicide. In the book, you distinguish between 4 terms, which is 1, suicide; 2nd, suicide attempt; 3rd, suicidal ideation, which I think simply means that where you think about committing the act; and 4th, non-suicidal self-injury, which I found a little difficult to understand, but perhaps how would you distinguish between these 4 terms? Although suicide and suicide attempt seems clear enough, but suicide ideation and non-suicidal self-injury in particular.
Okay, yeah, so I think it's, I wasn't expecting to start off with a technical discussion on suicide. But as you said, I mean, the first 2 terms are pretty obvious, and the others not as much, but the others are also something that we use quite a lot in our clinical work and clinical practice. And I said that I'm surprised that we're starting off with technical discussions, because the whole idea behind the book was to move beyond these technical discussions, Yeah, no, that's true. It's just that conversations in India around suicide are so much around mental health and clinical presentations of people who die by suicide, and that's where some of these terms come from. And we want to shift that narrative from that. For a person, for a lay person or a person in the community, although understanding some of these things is important, so for example, ideas of suicide or what is suicidal ideation, etc., I think it's not the most important thing to know. But I mean, technically, I mean, for us as clinicians, it basically means someone who is getting thoughts of ending their life or feels that life is not worth living, etc. So I mean, basically, that's what it means. But for us, it's that is not so important as changing the language to make it more accessible to people in terms of understanding what the phenomenon is, but also reducing the stigma around it, as you rightly pointed out. So for example, some of the words that you yourself used are commonly used by people on the street. So for example, committing suicide. I mean, we don't say that anymore, because that's like what we use with crime, right? Committing a crime. You're basically saying that this is something that a person intentionally did to themselves. They killed themselves, etc. But it's that kind of takes away from some of the severity of what happens. When you talk about dying by suicide, it's shifting that narrative away from kind of saying that this person did something wrong, and rather saying that this person experienced something which made them take this drastic step which led to them dying by suicide. So again, without going into too much detail about the technicalities of those terms, I think our whole idea in kind of putting that box there is, let's get this out of the way and let's talk about more important things related to suicide. Let's not get into the jargon, because that's not important.
Actually going to pick up on what you said about road traffic accident, because that's so interesting. If you're a young man in this country, if you're between the ages of say 18 to 30, the number one cause of death, you're going to die only if either by road traffic accidents, and the number two cause of death is suicide. So for young men in this country, the two things that kill them are both highly preventable and both highly neglected. Healthcare, they don't die because of illnesses. When you're young, you don't die because of illnesses. And for young women, for example, we've done such a wonderful job with our maternal mortality work. Our maternal and child health services have actually done a brilliant job to the extent that maternal mortality has dropped so dramatically that suicide is now the number one cause of death. A young woman in this country, the number one cause of why she's likely to die is going to be suicide and not maternal mortality, which also shows a couple of things. One is that it shows the neglect of suicide, so that we've actually not paid attention to suicides. But it also shows that when we decide we want to do something about it, we are able to. So like maternal deaths, which were very high, and we decided as a society we want to do something about it, we're actually able to bring them down. There's an interesting report which came out just a month ago, and it's not in the book because it's just come out a month ago. Kerala does this fantastic confidential report on maternal deaths in Kerala. So they actually go and do a detailed analysis of every woman who's died in that period during pregnancy and a year after childbirth, and they look for what might be the reasons and causes for death. And it's very interesting that last year's report, which has come out, 17% of maternal deaths which happened in that period of before delivery and after delivery, are because of suicides. 1 out of 6 women who die, what is classed as a maternal death, is also a suicide. So, apart from suicide itself being a problem, even within maternal deaths, it is suicide which is causing deaths. In fact, that report goes on to speak a lot about it, saying that this is so unusual and these numbers are going up and we've really not done anything about it. Now, in that age group, in that particular period, postpartum depression or antepartum depression is very common and not being picked or recognized maybe. So, we do have a lot of these things that we don't have. You had a point you said about why is there this silence about it? I like to call it the omerta. You know, there's an omerta on suicides. It's very interesting because, you know, my neighbor, where I live in Pune, there's a building with a block of flats next to us. And I don't really interact with people. I mean, for somebody who is a psychiatrist, I hate interacting with neighbors and people. I know that sounds very bizarre, but given a choice, I would not talk to anybody. You know, but so we have these neighbors, and there's a young couple there and all. And something came up. I don't know how the conversation came up with my wife, and you know, Seema said that, oh, you know, that guy died of suicide. I said, when? Like, died of suicide? Like, I live next door. What do you mean, died of suicide? And yeah, died of suicide many months ago. You don't know about it. And the fact is, I didn't know about it. So, you know, how it happens is, when people die of suicide, everything is kept very quiet and it's not talked about. I think it's more to do with, well, two things I would imagine they are. One is obviously the shame and, you know, trying to hide it because it in some ways seen as implying something negative about the family, and people don't want to then talk about it. There's also a moral bit to it, you know. Somehow there's a morality attached to it, which is that if you die by suicide, then it's in some ways a amoral or an immoral act to be doing. And many of, many religions actually have a lot of prohibitions against suicide. You know, it's considered a very bad thing to be doing. So I think it's that, and just generally in our country, yeah, see, there's also some legal issues, I think, with it, because of the way our laws are. If it's a young woman who's, say, married 2 or 3 years ago and she dies of suicide, the family wants to keep it really quiet, okay, and don't want a discussion on it because of 498 being around, and you don't want to get into a thing where somebody starts saying, oh, you know, arrest these people. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't talk about suicide, but fundamentally one of the reasons we also don't talk about suicide is because it scares us. And it scares us because all of us at times in our lives have thought of suicide. You know, there's not a single individual who's not had a suicidal ideas at some point in life, or at least even if they are fleeting ideas that you think, oh God, it's so terrible, I might as well die. And we haven't done it. The fact that you're here is that you didn't actually die by suicide. And I think the fear is that this is, you know, but for the grace of God, it could also be me. And there's this fear that somehow getting too close to it would imply that I would put myself at risk or something. You know, things that we are scared of because we don't know whether it will be us doing it at some stage in our lives. So I think there's a whole multiplicity of factors. Our policymakers are not interested for the simple reason is that policymakers have this feeling that whatever you do, suicides can't be prevented. Jisko marna hai, wo to marega. You know, there's a myth that people who want to kill themselves will anyway succeed in killing themselves. So policymakers don't want to hitch their wagon to something that is a losing cause, you know. So they are really not interested in it. So sometimes with policymakers, it's useful to actually not talk about suicide prevention, because in their head, suicide prevention means there should be zero suicide. But to talk about suicide reduction, because then there is no implication of a zero suicide. You're not saying zero hona chahiye. You're saying, oh, you know what, if we can bring it down 10-20% would be good enough. Yeah, but I'll stop here. I don't want to just go on and on and on.
It's interesting that you referenced your answer to morality, some kind of morality associated with suicide, because one of the questions I had later on, and I'll come to it immediately actually, in your chapter on understanding suicide, you look at variation in suicide rates across India and across the world as well, across gender, men and women, age, younger, older. I actually have two questions. They are both sort of linked, but the first question that actually came up was, and that is the morality part of it, do we have an understanding of how religion or belief in God matters for those who have these thoughts, or those who go on to attempt or to actually, commit suicide? Sorry, I'm using the wrong word. But suicide is considered sinful, right? I mean, it's Bhagwan ki aankhon mein ye, this is wrong. I mean, in some religions you will explicitly have that. Now, somebody with strong faith in God, what I'm basically asking is, if your faith in God or faith in life in general, if you have a strong faith, are you less likely to? So the dummy for that would be asking, do you believe in God? How strong on a scale of 1 to 10 do you believe in God? And if somebody says 9, and then the other question is, how often have you contemplated suicide? The answer may be lower. I mean, I just thought about it, when I was doing this question. So, is it connected to religion, strong belief in religion or God? So, not just gender or age or something else, but the second question, which is a more standard question, is you have a chapter on marginalized communities and how that makes a difference. I've been, of course, reminded of the classic work of on social determinants of health, for example, that your place in society, your particular status does have an impact on your health. That was on life expectancy, longevity, or how healthy a life you lead. But in general, do suicide rates vary substantially across class, caste, and in general your status in society?
Definitely. I mean, definitely a lot. To take I think there are different things. A faith, belief in God, spirituality, and religion. I think they have really little connection with each other, to be honest. Being part of a religion is like an organized grouping, whereas spirituality doesn't require that, and a belief in God is another variation from that.
I think another way to put it is that if you have a strong religious identity, and you are more likely to be part of a community than not. Whereas,
possibly, yeah. So, I mean, look, what we do know is there's very little research on the role of religion and suicides, but what we do know is that, for example, the prohibitions against suicide in the Abrahamic religions is quite high. So, Christianity, for example, or Catholicism particularly, has a lot of prohibitions around suicide, or even Islam has a lot of prohibitions around suicide. And it kind of draws upon, I suspect, from the philosophy of those religions, which is that your life is not yours, your life belongs to somebody else. So how can you take something that does not belong to you? Hinduism has not really always had any prohibitions against suicide, although it may not be looked upon favorably. So there is some research which shows that suicide rates among Muslims is lower than suicide rates among Hindus, for example. Again, what happens with all of these things is that religion is sometimes also a proxy for so many other things. So you wonder if it is those proxy factors. What I mean by proxy is that, if you control for the effects of poverty, if you control for the effects of gender, if you control for the effects of social class, after you control for all of that, is religion still an important factor for suicides? Is not something that we've had much research on. So that's what I think about it. And see, paradoxically, we had criminalization of suicides. The suicides were criminalized when the British really started off with their empire. That's when they started this very drawn upon the Victorian notion of preventing suicides by criminalizing suicide. So criminalizing attempted suicide. I always say that it's the only crime where you are punished if you fail, and they can do nothing to you if you succeed. It's the only crime where failure is punished. All other crimes you are punished only if you succeed in the crime. It seems like a very bizarre way, and this was based on the idea that if it would act as a deterrent from people trying to kill themselves, and it was drawn on some morality, whereas we know that from evidence that's not true. I mean, if it doesn't act as a deterrent. And the paradox of it has been that the UK got rid of the criminalization long time ago. But all of the countries where they went and put these laws, haven't got decriminalization done and are very aggressively anti-decriminalization. You know, if you talk to policymakers, they'll say, "Arey, that means you're giving people a license to kill themselves." You know, it's almost like before you kill yourself, you say, "Let me check what the law says." The law says I shouldn't kill. Oh my God, law says I shouldn't kill myself. Oh my God, what am I going to do? I shouldn't kill myself. I mean, people do that, is it? Like, I mean, you know, it's a very silly way to think that because something is written in the law, public karenge nahi. I mean, you just have to go out on the Indian roads and you'll know what is written on the law and what people do have got nothing to do with each other, you know. So this notion that because you got something in the law will prevent suicides doesn't happen. What in fact it does is two things. It does prevent people from seeking help. So when they attempt suicide, they won't seek help quickly because they are afraid that if they go to the hospital, then, you know, it'll become a legal case, it'll become a police case. And the second thing that it does is the police harass your family, because they'll come and say it's a law, legal case, and they'll harass your family, they'll kind of ask questions, all sorts of things. So criminalization has not really stopped people from dying, and Sri Lanka is a great example, and Singapore I think was another one, or not Singapore, some other country, now the name slips my mind, but Sri Lanka is a great example that after Sri Lanka decriminalized suicide rates actually went down in Sri Lanka. They didn't go up. Because you started accepting the fact that if people need help, then they get help quickly, rather than have to be at a point where, because their health is deteriorated so much, then somebody's taking them to the hospital. But you know, your other question of caste, class, gender, I mean, suicides are completely, you know, I sometimes feel that the whole mental health association of suicides is actually a big disservice that we do to mental health, to people who die by suicide or people who attempt suicide. You know, if you talk to any average person on the street and say, you know, we got lots of suicides in this country, what should we do? And immediately the answers will be something to do with mental health. We need more psychologists, we need more counseling, we need more psychiatrists, or we should treat depression. The fact remains that less than 50% of people who die by suicide actually have a mental health problem. You know, they don't have a mental health problem. That is not the cause of their death. And it's saying, you know, the mental health problem is a little bit like saying, let's say if people die of cardiovascular failure in the hospital, the death certificate died of cardiovascular failure. But died of cardiovascular failure, meaning that is the final common pathway through which many other conditions happen, you know. So, yes, you died of cardiovascular failure, but what are the causes which led to the cardiovascular failure? Similarly with depression, I mean, yeah, they had depression, but why were they depressed is the question we should be asking. If they were depressed because they had no food to eat, they had no job, or they were being abused or physically beaten up, or they had a problem with alcohol, then those are the real causes. The died of depression is just the last common pathway through which everything is happening. So, you know, our intent in the book has been to try and shift that conversation away from that final pathway to actually looking at more distal causes and do something about it before you reach that point, you know. I'm sure Abhi will probably have more to say on that.
Probably a little bit, kind of the first point that you raised about religion. I think it's very difficult to answer that question because there's not much research to kind of unequivocally say that either it's protective or not. And a lot of what we say is based on some understanding of what the religious texts of these books or the religious edicts say in terms of not taking your own lives, etc. I mean, like how Soumit referred to Islam and Christianity. But I think, again, by focusing on that, we are probably diverting our attention from the fact that when does a person die by suicide, or when does that person attempt to end their life? I mean, they do that when they have reached a stage where they feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. You know, you're so in such a desperate situation. You're pushed into a corner, and I think that's when that happens, a person is not going to think about what does my religion say, you know, what does my pastor say, or what's there in my religious books. I mean, they take that extreme step because they have reached a stage where they feel that nothing can happen. I mean, there can be no change. So I think in the absence of good evidence around whether religion is protective or not, we should probably be not making a big deal about it, and some of the kind of understanding of it comes from anecdotal evidence, you know, what we see in clinical practice and what people say, which is basically I feel like ending my life, but I am not going to do it because my religion stops me from doing it. But that anecdotal evidence is just that. I mean, it's a very biased evidence as well, right? Because you're speaking to people who do not end their lives by through suicide, but what about those who have? I mean, we can't really ask them those questions, isn't it? So I wouldn't kind of go down that route of looking at religion as protective or not. Rather, kind of keep it away from the conversation. And similarly with social determinants, as Soumitra said, I mean, although two of the three authors, I mean, me and Soumitra are mental health professionals and psychiatrists, and the whole idea behind this book was, let's not talk about mental health in this book, you know, because everyone talks about it, and it's seen as an easy way out sometimes to policymakers, because it seems like an rapid solution when it's not. But you can you say, okay, let's reduce depression and suicide rates will go down. Let's increase the number of psychiatrists and psychologists. It will go down. But actually, the real solutions or the real interventions that will help are things that are have a longer horizon, you know, for it to take impact, for it to have impact in terms of reducing suicides. And that's not what we are looking at. And using your earlier analogy or example of motor vehicle accidents, the same thing happens, right? And lots of motor vehicle accidents on Indian roads, young people are dying. What's the response? Let's have speed breakers. But that's not an appropriate response. But you're seen to be doing something when you have a speed breaker. But what's an appropriate response? You have appropriate licensing policies, ensure that people don't get licenses easily. People lose points when they break rules. All of these things are more appropriate responses, but they have a longer horizon in terms of showing impact. And so we have this tendency to go for short-term responses, which allow people to say that, oh, something is being done about this, but does not actually help in shifting the needle in terms of reducing suicides. So I think that's something that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I was also going to comment on the fact that, and it's not again in the book because the book went to press before the report came out. But you know, the national report on suicides, the National Crime Records Bureau publishes a report every year on suicides. And the 2020 report came out in 2021, around November of 2021, delayed anyway. But what it shows, and it's extremely worrying, and there's been absolutely no discussion in our communities about it, is that in the year 2020, which is the pandemic year, because March is when we started having the pandemic year, suicides in India went up by 10%, okay? Now, this is a huge increase only because if you look at the previous years, the increases are like 1%, 2%, 2.5%. And then suddenly you get this big peak. If you graph it, you can see how the graph suddenly goes like a hockey stick-like thing. You know, it's kind of curving here and then suddenly shoots up. And what is even more worrying is that while the suicides went up by 10%, suicides among children under the age of 18 went up by 18.5%, double the rate of increase. Okay, and suicides under 18 have been increasing at a rate of 1% or so every year. In the pandemic year, they are up by 18.5%. 11,500 kids under the age of 18 die of suicide every year. That's about, do the math, I think it's roughly about 320 odd kids dying every day or something like that, whatever that comes to. It's a terrible number. And then if you see what our policy response has been to under 18 suicides, you know, when you talk about under 18 suicides, even to the average public, and say, why do kids under 18 die? And most will say, oh, exam results. You know, that's the usual response, exam results. And so what policymakers will do is they'll put these counseling helplines in the month of June and July when board exams are coming, and there'll be advertisements from the Ministry of Health saying, don't take your life, and every result is that. But let's look at the data. Suicides in the pandemic here, under 18, and most, exam suicide, because they've classified by reasons. Exam suicides during the pandemic year actually went down by 28%. In the same time when suicides have gone up by 18%, exam suicides are down by 28%. So clearly there is a merit that exams do cause suicides, okay? And the fact that we didn't have exams in that time. So 28% reduction in exam suicides in a year where the kids' suicides have gone up by 18.5%. But what is also very interesting is that exam suicides only account for 10% of the suicides among under 18. So even if exam suicides went to 0, okay, that's only 10% of the number. The remaining 90% of the suicides are not exam-related suicides, So, there's a more complexity to this whole thing, which our policymakers don't seem to acknowledge or understand. So, you talk about suicides under the age of 18, the immediate response is, board exam ke samay ho raha hai, let's do something about it. Okay. Now, even with the board exam thing, and we've got this example in our book also, Tamil Nadu, which is a very progressive policy, about 10-15 years ago, introduced a supplementary exam. So, if your exam results come out, within a month you could resit the exam if you had just failed or if you wanted to improve your scores. And if you did that, then you would get your results immediately and you would continue as if nothing had happened. In a sense, your mark sheet wouldn't show that you failed and passed. You would be seen as having passed at your first attempt. And they started this supplementary exam. In the 15 years that after they started the supplementary exam, suicides after the board exam results have dropped by 50% in Tamil Nadu. Okay. In the same time, the number of kids taking the board exams has doubled. So while your kids taking the board, that's a huge, so effectively while your number of kids taking the exam has gone up twice, your number of suicides are halved. So that's like a 75% reduction if you were really looking at it. With a very simple policy intervention, it didn't require any great intervention. If, which mental health intervention is going to reduce suicides by 75%? I mean, I don't know of any mental health intervention which does that. And here is a simple low cost or a no cost intervention which just requires a small tweak in the way we make our rules. And I mean, the board exams are not some sacrosanct thing. I mean, it's a government-trained rule, the government can change it. Funnily enough, despite all of this evidence, not all states have adopted it. Now that's the funniest part of it. Now you would have thought, we've got evidence, we know it works, it's worked for 15 years, yet other states are reluctant to adopt it. A couple of states have just now started adopting it. So, what I'm saying is that even when the solutions stare us in the face, we don't want to do those solutions, and we would rather stick to some beliefs that we have, like, suicide counseling lines chalu kar do, helplines, let's start helplines. But we won't do the things that we know actually make a difference,
Actually, the Tamil Nadu example is very interesting because one of the things for, for development policies in general, broadly, is that how often we are willing to borrow or be inspired by foreign models of what works, what does not work. And here you have a successful example, very suitable for the Indian context, where there's a lot of pressure on kids for board exams and so on, and how such an intervention is successful, and yet nobody is really borrowing from it. Yes. So, samne mein rakha hua hai, yes. Tamil Nadu, it has worked. Why should it not work in Karnataka or Goa or anywhere else, right? And yet, we have, what you're telling us is that we have simply not bothered about the successful case.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know what the reluctance is. I mean, it's not like it's costing anybody anything. It's not taking a lot of effort. I still don't know what the reluctance to do it. I don't know what the situation in Goa is. We should actually explore and find out. Does Goa have a supplementary exam after 10th and 12th board exams? They do, huh? So see, some states have started to adopt it now. but most of the states will not adopt it. Goa actually also has a very high suicide rate, by the way. You know, Goa's suicide rate is very high, although Goa's absolute number of suicides are not very high, only because you got a small population. So it doesn't register as a, it doesn't register on the numbers because it's not a big number, but it's still a very high suicide rate state. So yeah, I mean, very few states have actually done that. So I still don't understand why policymakers will not do it. I also think that partly why policymakers don't do it is, one is, I think they're just ignorant. I'm giving them the benefit of doubt. They're just ignorant, okay? They don't know. Somebody needs to go and tell them that. My worry is that what happens is when they have a suicide problem, that imagine you're a secretary in government and you want to deal with suicide problem. What are you most likely to do? You'll pick up the phone and call up the head of department of psychiatry at the nearest government hospital. That's what you'll think of doing, right? I mean, that's how they would think. What is the head of department of psychiatry department going to say? What is he going to say? You can imagine what, I mean, turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas. He's not going to say we don't need mental health services. He's going to say, or mental health services. Oh, we need lots of mental health services. I need 5 more psychiatrists, please. Thank you so much. Since you're in a mood, give me the money for that. He's not going to say, sir, actually what you should be doing is now talk to the education secretary and get that policy changed. There's nothing for him to gain out of that, or her. I mean, I say him only because most of them tend to be him. But there's nothing to be gained out of that. So you see, we've created a situation where you're asking the wrong question to the wrong people for a wrong solution. What do you expect to happen,
I don't think there's anything to add after what Soumitra has said, but just to kind of address your point about models from the West and trying to adopt them, I think even if we wanted to do that, even if we're doing it, they are not a good fit for our context because the stories are completely different. Whereas suicides, the narrative behind suicides in the West is around mental health. I mean, a large proportion of people dying of suicide in the mental health have an underlying mental health condition. It's completely different in India. It's the social determinants that kind of lead or explain a lot of the suicides that are happening in India. And even within India, there's lots of complexities around those social determinants and suicide as well. So for example, I mean, common sense would dictate to us that the suicide rates in the less socioeconomically well-performing states would be, higher as compared to the more developed states. That was going to be a question. Okay, can I preempt the question in that case? And so one would expect that the numbers would be higher, rates would be higher in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, etc. I mean, they're traditionally less well-performing states. But what we see is exactly the opposite. I mean, the numbers and the rates in the better off states in the South India, like Tamil Nadu, etc., are a lot higher than these states, except for Chhattisgarh, which I think has traditionally not been, has been living up to kind of those expectations that one would have. And we don't really know why that is happening. Well, it's not clear, because no one has actually researched it, and everything that we kind of try to explain these phenomena is around speculation. I mean, we speculate that this might be the cause, but we don't really know why that is happening. So hence, 2 reasons why we would not kind of go down the route of importing Western models and trying to respond to these problems. And even within India, I mean, trying to fit a one-size-fits-all kind of a model to these states would also be problematic, because I don't think those will fit. I mean, every state will require an tailored response to the issue within the states, because there are so many complexities around these social determinants. I mean, poverty, class, caste, I mean, all of these things are interacting with each other when it comes to suicide in India, and we have to be mindful of all of those when we're responding to it.
Abhijit, the problem I had while framing this question, which I was going to ask you and which you have sort of answered, is that when we talk about the North-South distinction, I mean, we make, South, you have, more prosperity compared to the poorer states. It feeds into the narrative, unfortunately, of, poor being happier than the rich, in a very convoluted way, that, you are more prosperous in the South, or, I remember reading a report a long time ago from my graduate school days, which was, this was data looking at mental health problems in cities across the world. And there were 3 cities on that list which struck me. One was Paris topped the list. So the largest number of people per 100,000 population who were seeing shrinks for their mental health. So it was in terms of shrinks. Second was Buenos Aires. And the joke about Buenos Aires is that, you don't really have an identity unless you see a shrink. So everyone. So yeah. So that's the joke about Buenos Aires, and to some extent about Paris too. The third was in Santiago. That was where I was actually at that time, working on Chilean politics and health sector reforms. And in Chile, when I would ask people about this, and also a couple of people who worked in the area of public health and mental health more specifically, they traced it back to, and one could do that for Argentina as well, because they suffered from long years of authoritarian rule. So, regimes that have gone through long years of brutal dictatorships. I mean, Argentina had its dirty war, 2 series of, in 66 to 73, 76 to 83, Chile under Pinochet. Of course, Paris in that sense was a complete outlier. You had all the freedoms, democracy, etc., the good Parisian life, so to say, and yet, so the question is, and this is not your area at all, but does it force us to think about the idea, rethink about the idea that to be happy, and I'm seeing happiness as something quite opposite to, the kind of things we are talking about, as not related to one's income. And lack of mental health, again, I mean, the class distinction, while it is important, it may not always hold in all contexts. That it could be true in certain contexts. And once we do that, again, we are probably left to go back to religion, community, social life. These are all very slippery ideas. I mean, that.
Well, I mean, look, let's take the example of Kerala. Kerala is extremely well off. Literacy rates are close to 100%, which is always then associated with, and I'm not taking the example of Goa because you will say, oh, Goa is a tiny state, so it's not a proof of a larger thing. Yeah, but the thing is with Kerala, you have high levels of education, high levels of prosperity, more women in employment than maybe in other parts of the country. Now, you would expect that Kerala would have low suicide rates, no? And women's suicide rates would be lower, whereas they're actually higher in Kerala. And I think what it does is because what happens very often, this is like trying to answer your question partly with that, is that while you might have prosperity and education, which is all the things that we say, oh, if you do this, then probably you get better health outcomes, education, women's education in particular, better health outcomes. The problem that it creates is that within all of that, Kerala, like every other part of India, continues to have a very patriarchal society. So in fact, what it does is it causes more cognitive dissonance for the woman. This is my theory of it, that it causes more cognitive dissonance for the woman in Kerala than it does in Bihar. Okay, so that in Bihar, the woman is probably not educated, has no other opportunities of leaving the home, in a sense doesn't know what could be different, whereas in Kerala, because the woman's been exposed to education, because she's been exposed to, because she works somewhere and probably has an income of her own, but then you come back to a very patriarchal family setting, because across India remains the same, whether you're in Kerala or in Bihar, then that causes more cognitive dissonance because you've seen what it could be better, so your dissatisfaction levels with life will be higher because you actually know that things could actually be better, that the grass is greener on the other side. But when you've not seen the other side and there is no grass, you probably think this is all that is there to life. So it's more complex than just, I think, in a very paradoxical way, when people say, why should prosperity cause more suicides, for example? Prosperity also brings with it unhappiness, not because of the prosperity, but because the prosperity does not then match your social structures. You see the improvement in education, the improvement in financial status has now outpaced the improvements in our social structures. And that is now causing a dissonance, I think, which causes more unhappiness for people. And especially for women, as an example, but for any other parts of our society who kind of, so caste would be another thing, so while somebody, say from a Dalit caste, might have actually, the conditions for the Dalits have improved to some extent, and they might have actually economically done well, for example, or because of reservations they've actually got education also. But the fundamental issue of the fact that your neighbor still treats you as an untouchable, and that has not changed, actually causes more dissonance for that Dalit person, because how do you square up this? You were told that if all this happened, you would be treated as an equal, whereas you're not. So I think it's, I don't think it is economic prosperity which brings unhappiness, because I know that our newspapers love to say, "Haan, paisa hai to bhi dukhi hi rehte hai log," and money brings unhappiness. I don't think that's true. Money doesn't bring unhappiness. I don't mind any amount of unhappiness. Please give me the money. I mean, honestly, I'm happy to take the world's unhappiness. If, give me the billions, I'll be more than happy to have all the unhappiness. Money doesn't bring unhappiness. I think it's the dissonance between the fact that while your economic status improves, but your social status is still stuck there, is what causes the problem. It's a long-winded explanation. I don't know.
Abhijit, what are the numbers for difference in suicide rates among white Americans and African Americans? I mean, not.
I think they are higher for the black Americans, and it's also very interesting. You asked that question during the pandemic. The U.S. suicide rates didn't go up. Okay, so the average suicide rate for USA has remained the same, but suicide rates for black Americans went up. Okay, which is interesting because the narrative that is now being sold in the West, at least, is that pandemic had no effect on suicide rates, so it didn't go up. Suicide rates didn't go anywhere. But when you start looking even within those countries where suicide rates didn't go up, you see that marginalized sections suicide rates have gone up. So that the suicides among black Americans went up, suicides among the poor went up. But generally suicides as a total didn't go up. But the total always hides a lot of complexities in there.
Let me get to my favorite question. When I prepared my questions, I thought this is something I like. And that's also because I do some writing, reading on India's demographic dividend, right? We are the youngest country in the world as of now, and the share of India's young population, which is approximately 15 to 24, or even a bit higher, that will continue to grow at least up to another 10 years, and then begin to decline only gradually. It'll just get older. But the point is that we have been talking about this demographic dividend for a long time. We have been talking about things like, we are facing a demographic disaster. When you look at newspapers, you have a skills crisis. You have people with all kinds of fancy degrees not finding jobs. You have a jobs crisis as well. But there was something in the chapter on demographic dividend, and that one sentence, I'm going to read it out for everyone, and then we'll begin with you, which is, okay, India's demographic dividend is killing itself. So I have read the chapter, but others have not, I think. So could you please explain what is it that you were trying to convey with that one single sentence, which is actually, if you read it and absorb it, you suddenly realize, gosh, I mean, it is not about jobs, it's not about anything else, it is about, in terms of suicides, India's demographic dividend is killing itself. So you have, on the one hand, a crisis in the education sector in particular, or the skills required to be part of a, of a growing economy. Then you have a crisis in terms of the number of jobs that are being created, and this is almost like a third pillar of crisis that India's young people are facing.
So I think the simplest response to this would be to look at the numbers. I mean, the biggest killer of young people in India is suicide, and the other one is motor vehicle accidents, as you said. So if you look at the numbers, I mean, numbers don't lie. I mean, there's nuance to numbers as well. But I mean, if you look at numbers at a very high level, they don't lie. I mean, we know that our so-called demographic dividend we are not taking care of it. And I have stopped believing in this whole narrative around demographic dividend in India, because the demographic dividend does not work unless you take care of it. You know, it's like our investments. If we don't take care of it, it's worthless. It's not going to grow. So we only use it as a slogan. You know, India's demographic dividend. We have got these many number of young people who are going to kind of determine a golden future for India and all of that. But unless we create an infrastructure for them which allows that dividend to flourish, unless we create an ecosystem where we can protect them, all of that is not going to lead to any benefits to the country. And these three pillars that you spoke about, you know, education, employment, and suicide, well, I don't even look at them as separate pillars, because they are interlinked. I mean, based on some of the responses that Soumitra gave. But I mean, the fact that both of these are important social determinants that interact with young people's lives and them dying by suicide, I think it's an important consideration for us. Not just looking at this demographic dividend as something that we need to protect by reducing suicide rates, but also looking at how these other two pillars interact with it, change the ecosystem around that, and try to protect and nourish this demographic dividend. Otherwise, that demographic dividend is just, quote unquote, a couple of words, a slogan that we are going to use until we lose it. And I think it's very, very important for us to take it.
I mean, I've been looking at the numbers recently. So for the next 20 years, the share of the working age population is going to keep increasing. It is already increasing in the southern states, where you have population growth has slowed down considerably. The maximum growth in the size of the young population is going to come from growth in the population growth in the states of UP, Bihar, Punjab, and two other states. So these are the states, mind you, where in terms of education, health, etc., you know, they are pretty much not at the bottom, but they're not doing as well as the southern states. So you have more and more young people in these 5 states, which will contribute to India's population growth among that young population. And these are the states least equipped to actually take advantage of their young people. Of course, there's the option of migration from these states to the other states. I mean, if you look at the number of colleges per 10,000 or per 100,000, it is highest in states like Karnataka or Andhra Pradesh and so on. And you know, not so much in UP, which has the largest number of colleges, but per 10,000 population, it's pretty low. So migration is the only solution which one can see. And not everybody from these states can migrate to Pune or Bombay or to Delhi. And which brings with it its own set of problems. So, you know, you're right. I mean, it has become a slogan. I have been looking at these numbers. I told myself that I'll be kind. And I said, look, my conclusion is going to be that India's demographic dividend is being curtailed by, you know, lack of investments in young people. And it is going to continue to be curtailed unless something is done about population growth in these 5-6 states, which are going to see about, which are going to account for 60% of the population growth among the young people. So that's a very, very large number. That's looking 20 years ahead. But nobody's talking actually about these things, right?
Well, I mean, one of the things nobody is talking about, which is also very worrying, it's like, you know, I'm going to stick my neck out and make a prediction, knowing fully well that I will probably, I'll be glad to be wrong. In fact, I'll put it this way. Let's look at what happened to Greece in 2008. If you go back to Greece in 2008, you know, they had a major economic crisis. If you remember, Greece went bankrupt, and there was also this talk of their currency collapsing, and unemployment rates in Greece shot up dramatically to 25 and 30%, which in Europe is like a crazy number of unemployment, and youth unemployment had reached some 50 and 60% at that time. what happened to suicides in Greece is very instructive, okay? The suicide rates in 2008 did not increase. Suicide rates started increasing with a lag period of about 8 to 10 months, okay? So that in 2009, the suicide rates were up by 17% or something. 2010, they were again up by another 17-20%. 2011, they were up. So they went up with a lag and they went on for 4 years. So that by 2012, actually the economic crisis was over, but the suicides were still happening at a higher rate. And it's only after that they started dipping, okay? So here's my prediction. Suicide rates in India in 2020 went up by 10%. Yeah. See, the pandemic has also been an economic crisis. Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact of the economic crisis is that why does economic crisis hit after a lag? One of the reasons I speculate is what happens is you have some amount of resources left with you. It's only when those resources are expended and you're completely broke or your neighbors are broke and everyone's now broke and nobody's got any money is when, you know, so as to say, things hit the fan. So what happens is that we've seen in 2020 our suicide rates go up. What you also seen is that the suicide rates went up higher among the unemployed in that year. So I'm very sure that when 2021 figures come and when 2022 figures come and when 2023 figures come, we will continue to see these rising suicide rates going ahead.
And also the social security net in India is
absent, exactly. So I think we are in for a good 2 or 3 years of 10, 5, 15% increases in suicide rates. Now what that does is it's like inflation. If you know how inflation works is when you get 10% inflation for many years, like say 3 or 4 years, and then if inflation even drops to 0, what it still means is you're at that elevated level, you know. You don't, inflation coming to 0 doesn't mean rates have gone down. What it only means is that they've stopped growing. So what will happen is that we will suddenly find that our base of suicides, which for many years we used to run at that 130,000, 150,000, 40,000, 35, 40,000, that base will now shift to like 190,000 or something. And then again, you'll be at that plateaued level. So my worry is that this is stuff we can actually anticipate based on what has happened in the past in other countries. But we are merrily kind of sailing away without a thought, you know, like you can, like there is the iceberg and the Titanic continues to sail without a thought at it. Like, yes, we are not afraid of the Titanic.
No, it's not a pleasant idea
It
at
isn't,
all.
but then what do you do? How do you wake up people? How do you tell people, listen, there's an iceberg there, okay? You're going to hit it. Like, हाँ, वो तो ठीक है, but और कुछ कर रहे हैं. और क्या करना है? There's an iceberg there. What are you doing? The captain of the ship, man. There's an iceberg. Other important things to do.
Okay, so this is not exactly from the book, okay? So I said, okay, I found the book incredibly interesting. I hadn't read anything on this subject or on mental health for a very long time. So I said, okay, one of the things I'm going to do is, let me do a Google search. And that's because I have been randomly reading about, you know, brain research. Not in any specialized way, but being broadly aware that what we know about the human brain is actually very, very little. That's all. I mean, that's all. And I know that there is a Scientific American journal dedicated to brain research, right? I remember seeing its cover, occasionally went through it, and I said, no. It's too much. So anyway, now, so I did a Google search of our brain and suicide, okay? And on page 1, I'm just going to read out the headlines. Understanding the Suicidal Brain, the British Journal of Psychiatry, right? Another one I found, The Origins of Suicidal Brains, Scientific American. Then there's a third one, Suicide Victims Found to Have Abnormal Brain Cells. This is from Life Science. I don't know how credible this website is, but you know, at least the first two I know, British Journal of Psychiatry and Scientific American. On the other hand, then there was a World Economic Forum statement. And I'll just read the headline again. Will we ever understand the human brain? Right, with a question mark. And this is from 2022. My question is this. There's a lot of interesting research being done on the brain. A lot of research clearly on, you know, the kind of brain we have and suicides. But again, based on how much or how little we know about the human brain, what can we reliably say about the relationship between the human brain and suicides? And to the extent that our brain determines our behavior, how are suicides preventable? Because if it's something to do with our brain, which is of course going to be conditioned by things like hunger as well, just as anxiety. I mean, these will of course change our, I think I remember seeing on the first page itself other things about, this changes the way your brain is and so on and so forth. So our brain changes with the context, right? I mean, long years of exposure to certain social realities, right? So what do we know about the relationship between our brain and suicidal behavior? Second, to the extent that the brain determines our behavior, how are suicides preventable?
I think the first thing I want to point out is all the sources of your information that you pointed out there are a global health, global north narrative, right? I mean, British Journal of Psychiatry, American journals, etc. So we have to be very mindful of what the source is, and the general mental health narratives and that come out from North America and Britain and not as much in mainland Europe. There are lots of similarities with what I see within my other area of expertise. It's addictions. There is a very reductionist approach to this issue when you talk about brain and how brain, understanding how brain works is going to solve this problem about suicides. The complexity lies in the fact that the brain does not reside in some kind of vacuum. It's not. It interacts with life. It interacts with all of these other things that you spoke about. I mean, poverty, hunger, all of the things that happen around us. So, having this idea that we could somehow figure out what's happening in the brain when it comes to suicide and correcting it in some way is at best a fancy notion. So so I would I would kind of read this, understand this, but also understand that this is a very small piece of the larger jigsaw. Understanding the pathways through which kind of these mechanisms in the brain work in suicide is important, but what's more important is not trying to minimize that such a big issue to kind of a very simplistic understanding around neurotransmitters or how the brain functions, etc. If we have to reduce this problem of suicides, then we need to, something that we keep harping on over and over again, we need a multi-sectoral response to a complex problem. So, which requires, keep mental health aside. Let's not talk about mental health. We've spoken a lot about mental health and suicides. There's no point in talking more about it. Let's talk about the structural determinants, the social determinants of suicide. Let's talk about education, the interventions that we can bring about in education. Let's talk about employment. Let's talk about poverty alleviation. Let's talk about the social security nets. Let's talk about amongst young people, relationships, resilience. How do you kind of build up resilience amongst young people? Let's talk about the whole agrarian crisis, and that's nothing to do with mental health, although the mental health final pathway might be mental health, as Soumitra said. But how do we resolve that issue? And that's to do with irrigation. That's to do with managing pesticides. That has nothing to do with mental health. So if we are looking at interventions within the space of mental health, we are barking up the wrong tree. There is enough evidence to show that by trying to reduce depression or bringing in more psychiatrists, psychologists, we are not going to solve this problem. So I think the bottom line for me, if there was one thing in terms of interventions I want people to take away from our book is, let's stop talking about mental health interventions. I think it's a response in the negative, but that's my kind of main response to this question about what are the interventions.
Yeah, we In the 1950s, we basically had brainless psychiatry because, under the influence of Freud and all, we had only brainless psychiatry, which was all.
And then, of course, you had pharmaceutical companies, right?
No,
I mean, the
pharmaceutical company. Well,
research and
so then you have the pharmaceutical companies which came in. So you started having mindless psychiatry. So, and hopefully we will reach a point where you'll have a brainful and mindful psychiatry, which takes both these into account and which is socially, in the social substrate that it is grounded in. And one lives and hopes that that will happen, if not in my lifetime, in somebody else's lifetime. See, the whole brain issue, which is what I think Abhi is quite right about it, is, the NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, which funds a lot of research on mental health. Tom Insel was the director. In the 1990s, declared it in a very grandiose way. He got the president to declare it the decade of the brain. Whatever that means. This is a great grandiose idea, decade of the brain. And so they suddenly decided that we're going to stop funding research on anything to do with therapy or social determinants. You're only going to fund research on finding out mechanisms in the brain which will cause it. Okay, so billions of dollars, okay, billions, not millions.
So basically, I have my memories about brain research from that time.
Yes.
Because newspaper headlines or whatever you picked up, there was always some update on, something new has been found out about the human brain. And then you looked at the numbers somewhere, we know 3% or 2% about the human brain. And they said, what the hell do we know?
So, but see, so the thing is, after those billions of dollars spent for a whole decade and 3 decades later, and 5 decades after they first came up with this theory that, it's chemical locha in the brain which causes depression. 5 decades later of that chemical locha theory from the 1950s, the evidence level is still at the Munna Bhai level. No evidence. But it is still chemical locha in the brain. No evidence, and I'm telling you as a psychiatrist, there is no conclusive evidence that depression is because of some chemical problems in the brain. Let's face it. That is the reality of it. It's a hypothesis. It's a wonderful hypothesis. It's a hypothesis like God exists. How do you prove God doesn't exist? We'll keep on searching till we find it. So, there is no evidence for it, but we still continue, there's a lot of money being poured into all of that kind of research. Now, on the other hand, let me tell you some stuff where if you poured money, you'll get results tomorrow morning, okay? Brazil had this wonderful experiment in the 2000s on when Lula was the president in 2003. Brazil came up with what is called the BFP, the Bolsa Familia. Yeah. Now, the Bolsa Familia is a very interesting program. It's a conditional cash transfer. And the conditional cash transfer is the conditions are actually not very onerous. The conditions are that if you are getting a cash transfer and poor people would get a cash transfer. But the condition was that you should ensure your kid goes to the government school and the government would ensure that good schools were provided. That if you were a woman who was getting a cash transfer and you were pregnant, you had to go for your antenatal care. Now, if you didn't go for your antenatal care, you will not get your cash transfer. So actually, it wasn't conditional to you doing other behaviors, but some stuff that is good for you, and the behaviors that you had to do were also free. Okay, and the conditional cash transfer was only $17 a month. It's like, even in today's money, if you multiply, let's take $20 a month, you're looking at 1,500 rupees. Nothing more than that. That's the conditional, that's the cash transfer they were getting. And over 15 years, Brazil has collected data on about 100 million people who have received the cash transfers. Brazil's population today is 200 million. So huge number of people over the 15 years have received the cash transfer. And they have very good data on it. And so somebody went back and looked at the data. The suicide rate among people who had received the cash transfer versus the people who didn't receive the cash transfer, who were equally poor. So you control for everything else, except that one group got the cash transfer and the other group did not get the cash transfer. Suicide rates were down in the people who got the cash transfer by 60%, 60. Okay, 60% reduction in suicides among people who had got a cash transfer, $17 a month. My point is, why not just give everybody the $17 a month and shut down everything else, no? 60% reduction in suicide, great, all of us can go home and party on the beach, no? Why waste money on health sector and psychiatrists and counselors and helplines? Sabko $17 de do yaar. You know, it will bring suicide rates down, no? I mean, I know you're making it sound like mazak kar raha hai, but that is the reality of it. A similar experiment in Indonesia, you know, in Indonesia they picked up people who are 10% of the poorest of the poor, 10%, lowest 10%. And give them cash transfers. And if you compare the ones who got a cash transfer versus didn't, suicide rates down by 20%. Okay, these are big numbers, okay? 20% reduction, 60% reduction, the Tamil Nadu example showing 75% reduction. So what I'm trying to say is that the solutions to reducing suicides already exist with us today. We don't have to wait for another decade to find out those chemical things in the brain which might be...
And the solutions are not in mental health.
And the solutions are not in mental health. That is exactly the point. The solutions exist today and we should be doing something about implementing those solutions today if we want to save lives. The BFP in Brazil, even more interesting about the BFP data is that the effect was most pronounced in in women and young people. So, you know, if you're worried about your demographic dividend and you don't want them to kill themselves, then that's probably the thing we should be doing, you know. So my point is that if you put all of these things together, you know, where are the solutions? The solutions lie with the economics, the solutions lie with education, the solutions lie with employment, the solutions, and we've not touched upon this at all, the solutions lie with domestic violence, okay. You know, that's another big area which we don't do anything about. A third of women who die in this country of suicide have a history of domestic violence. Now, that's 1/3 of the women who are dying of suicide, and if domestic violence is such a big issue, and what are we doing about domestic violence, and do the domestic violence programs actually target suicide, you know? The cash transfer program is very interesting because, you know, you'd say again, Brazil ka hai, Brazil ka nahi hai. There is data from India also. You know, the Janani Suraksha program, I don't know how many of you know, the Janani Suraksha program basically gives out a cash transfer to pregnant women. And in UP, what happened was, because of some issues with the way the program was implemented, you had a situation where women some eligible women got the cash transfer and some eligible women did not get the cash transfer. So you now had a natural experiment which was created. What do you find? The women who got the cash transfer, rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, everything is lower, you know. So my point is very simple. Why are we distributing antidepressants? Why don't we just give out cash?
Well, because antidepressants, you can advertise for them. Much more successful.
I'll tell you also, it is also driven by morality. You know, there's a moral thing in this. What do you mean, give people money for free, for doing nothing? There's a morality to it. No, we have to help people to get better means dawai de do. So that is not seen as an immoral thing to do. The immorality comes out of saying, what do you mean, just give poor people free money? Like, yeah, just like give hungry people free food. I mean, I don't see the problem with that. Like, you know, if you're hungry, you don't want a pill. You want food. So if you're poor, you don't want a pill, you want money. So, you know, it can't be too complicated than that. I'm really sorry, but I don't understand what these guys talk complicated stuff about morality. For me, the morality is very simple. If you see a poor man, what do? You'll give him food, no? So, you know, what is the idea of saying, hang on, but let me just check with you, or let me counsel you. Maybe you're depressed and I'll treat you. Excuse me, but I've not eaten something for 3 days. No, we'll help you in such a way as you will not feel the hunger that you have now. What's wrong with our society? You know, like the guy is hungry and he's depressed because he's hungry and he's not eaten for 3 days. The simplest thing for us to be doing is give out food, no? Not to say, Arey, we'll send you to a counseling center. I mean, you know, during the pandemic, you talk to the people who ran the crisis helplines, okay? Because I have spoken to them, okay? People, they would say, you know, they opened a lot of these, governments opened a lot of crisis helplines during the pandemic. And you talk to the guys who worked on the crisis helpline, they would say, we were getting lots of calls where people would say, what were the calls to the crisis helpline for? Paisa nahi hai ration ke liye. Ghar mein ration nahi hai, bacche ko khilane ko nahi hai. What is that crisis helpline counselor going to do? They say, yaar, main kya karu, main kya kar sakta hu? I can't help you get a ration. Matlab, I can counsel you though, so that you don't feel so depressed about it. but ration ka to main kuch nahi kar sakta. I can't do anything about ration. Now, it's that kind of a thing, so we don't address the practical stuff that exists in front of us, and then we want to make it in, and I think that narrative is also driven by our chattering classes, if I can call them that, because for the professionals, our social divide is such, and the fact is that the poor are seen as passive recipients and are never part of the discussion. They're never there in the room as part of the discussion. This discussion is by the well-off, highly educated, English-speaking people who are more intelligent and know all the answers to everything. And for them, things like not having dinner on the table is not an issue, no? See, that's never been an issue. That's not a concern for them. So their concerns then get into this whole issue about, we need therapy, we need counseling, we need self-actualization, all of that stuff, whereas for the vast majority of Indians, it's not that at all which leads to suicide. I'm sorry if I'm sounding really nasty.
Okay, the last part, usually I do 3 questions and then give it to the audience, but today I was enjoying it too much, so I just had to more or less finish with what I had written down. Questions from the audience? Just introduce yourselves before you ask the question.
Nice presentation. Sorry, the discussion, the argument that you're making, but I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate. So if mental health lobby has to pass the buck, then it has to happen from both sides. One is that you have to have the conversations in education spaces, in health spaces, and so on and so forth, to sort of for people to recognize the role that they have, or what thread they can pick up in the capacity that they can to respond to suicide. But where does that leave the mental health professionals, who've been doing suicide prevention for as long as they know? So what happens to mental health professionals? That's my question.
First of this was not a fixed question. I hadn't told you to ask me this question, I think calling it passing the buck is being a bit too extreme, because we are not passing the buck. We are not saying that it's not our problem, you guys do it. I mean, what we are only trying to say is that it's a bigger problem than only mental health. We will do our bit, but others too need to do their bit. I think that's kind of slightly different from passing the buck. It's like, let's share the buck in a way. So where does that leave mental health professionals? I think there are broadly, I would say, 2 roles for mental health professionals as I see them. One is at a public health level, like the kind of the ones which we will try to play, which is trying to solve this problem. Okay, that's us trying to be a bit grandiose, but attempting to do something about it at a public health level by trying to influence policymakers, generating evidence, etc. And then there always remains a role for mental health professionals at an individual level, right? I mean, we are not saying that there's no depression driving suicides. We are not saying that people will not require counseling. People will require counseling, and that's where the role of individual psychiatrists, psychologists, other mental health professionals come in. But not at the cost of trying to solve this other bigger problem. So there's a role for everyone to play. What we're only trying to say is, all this while that role was being played by mental health professionals who are not fully equipped to kind of resolve this problem, and hence we need to bring in other people into this narrative, and hence we are passing the buck onto the others.
I agree with Abhi. We are not trying to pass the buck or asking them to pass the buck, but really trying to shift the attention. A lot of the suicide narrative in India has been focused on the individual. It's been focused, and that's where therapy, counseling, and all that fits in. So the narrative has been exclusively individual. It's about what is in this person's mind at this point in time they die by suicide. What we are trying to say is that, look, while that narrative has value, and limited value, there is an even bigger narrative which is away from the individual and onto society. So we just want to say that, look, there is a narrative which is, while matters, there's also society. And you know, that shouldn't be so complicated for people to understand today. Because if there is one thing that the pandemic has taught all of us, is that mental health problems don't happen to other people, they happen to all of us. Okay? And given the wrong set of circumstances, all of us are liable to having a mental health issue or thinking of suicide. You know, it's like a tsunami, that once you have a tsunami, however strong your house is, it's going to get swamped anyway. So we are just telling you there is a tsunami there, and you guys are just talking about, my house walls are better than his house walls, and how can we strengthen his house walls? There's a tsunami swamping over us, which is what is happening in the background in society. And we want to get people to actually pay attention to that. That's really what we are trying to do. Not trying to say, oh, you shouldn't build a house with strong walls. Of course you should build a house with strong walls. But that if the tsunami is going to wash over everything, then that's not going to make a difference, you know, if I can put it that way.
One is that, can we see suicide as not a kind of a, can we dissociate suicide from mental health issues, which I think both of you talked about. Can it be, like, I may sound a bit weird, like, can it be a choice, individual choice, that we have the motivation to live? We can have the motivation to die also. Suppose, like, from phenomenologically kind of a situation, I may choose to end my life. I might not have economic problem, might not have mental health issues, but at some point of time, I don't feel like that I continue this life. That can happen. Is that, those kind of considerations are dealt with? Because my second question is related to this, because you talked about a lot of economic issues, and in India, a lot of suicide happens because of economic disasters, like farmer suicide is economic issue. So, but if you look, like, and you talked about giving subsidies, I agree with all these things. So, but problem is that, but if you see countries like Japan, countries like in Scandinavia, their standard of living is very high. Those rank very high in the, like even like other indicators, like gender equity and all those things. But their suicide rate is quite high. Japan's suicide rate is, I understand, you know better, is quite high. So there, all these issues don't don't matter that much. But my point is that when we talk about decriminalization, when you're supporting decriminalization, then the suicide as a choice should also be respected. And it might not always be related to mental health issues or economic issues. It can be a choice.
Yeah, so look, I mean, you know, I mean, Japan, I'm not going to address the Japan issue only because you know, our point has been that, and which is what Abhiray said right at the beginning, which is that if you're looking at suicide reduction, then you have to look at what are the drivers of suicides in that particular culture and society. So, you know, even within India, different states have different drivers. So we should be looking at that. You know, Japan is a very aging society, and in the West, suicides have always been a problem of older people. In India, it's a problem of younger people. I mean, that's one big difference between India and the West or any of these high-income countries. But to get to your specific point about choice, suicides might be a matter of choice, but the question is there a choice? You see, that there needs to, is there a choice? A choice implies, you know, a choice does not imply you can have any color of the car as long as it is black. That's not choice, you see. That doesn't give anyone a choice. So choice implies that there are two alternatives that are available to you, where the alternative on one hand is that, you know, if somebody says that I'm bankrupt and I don't have money to feed my children, or you know, there are other issues happening in my life and my husband beats me up every night and black and blue and I have broken bones, then to choose to die, is that choice, you know? I mean, like, so my point is the word choice is very loaded. When is choice really a choice versus a compulsion is what we need to really be looking at. So yes, people have a right, I certainly feel people have a right to exercise their choice, but we should try and create circumstances where people choose to live rather than choose to die. You see, if you create circumstances which makes people choose to live, and then if they still choose to die, that's a different question altogether. But when you have circumstances where people, you created such terrible circumstances around people that they don't choose to live because of those terrible circumstances, then is that a choice is my only question, you know. So I think the word choice is very loaded. And so I would actually try and get into saying what is choice and when do people actually choose, and what is it that they are choosing. If there is nothing to choose, then there is no choice, is what I would say, you know. Yeah.
Please assume that there is no economic kind of problem for that person. I'm from my micro point of view I'm talking about. There is no economic issue, there is no mental issue. Suppose suppose sometimes we leave job, we leave a place, we move to another place. So we make such decisions. So one of the decisions is to end life also.
See, the government of, you know, there's a court case going on just now in the Supreme Court. I don't think they've not yet pronounced judgment, but somebody went to court and said that the Jain practice of Santara, okay? Santara is, if you know the practice of Santara is people voluntarily choose to give up their life. They don't have depression, they don't have a financial crisis, they don't have, their husband's not beating them up, none of that stuff, but they're basically voluntarily choosing to give up their life, and it's done at a certain life stage when they say my life, you know, my life's work is, so as to speak. And there's a case in the court saying that, look, this is not suicide. This is a very different thing, and so the laws of suicide should not apply to that. And they had filed a case because you had this, because of the criminalized, so you know, the attempted suicide, and in some states police were charging these people who go on the Santara fast with attempted suicide, section 309. And so they'd gone to court on that, saying, look, this is not Santara at all, this is not suicide. And I would agree that there is a difference between that and suicide, you know. So what you're talking about is very close to that Jain practice of Santara, which is, there's no problem in my life, but I've reached a certain point in my life where I'm going to voluntarily give up my life. And the way they voluntarily, and it's very interesting, the voluntary giving up of life is not a painless process. Huh? They go on a fast to death, effectively. So it's actually a very painful process to die. So you have to be mentally ready that, look, I have really reached the end of the road and I'm going to do this. So, you know, that's where then choice comes into it. You know, that's where choice is being made by that person. So I do think that, yes, that's possible. And I wouldn't call that suicide at all. I wouldn't say this is suicide. That's not suicide at all. That's a completely different phenomena to suicide.
I'm not totally referring to that. Like, I understand the Jain practice, but that they practice after a point, like after you reach a certain stage. So they don't take medication and they naturally end their life. So that, I mean, a 25-year person can choose death. My point is that it's not, we can isolate it from economic issues or mental health issues.
If we can have the ideal situation where there is, you know, like Elon Musk tomorrow decides that he wishes to die, I would very much strongly not stop him from doing it. I'm assuming that he does not have any problems in life, and I wouldn't really want to stop him for various reasons.
I think this is kind of bordering on euthanasia, is what you're getting at. And suicide and euthanasia are completely different. And talking about Scandinavian countries, they are forward enough to actually allow euthanasia. You know, where a man chooses to die. He may be a young person who's on his deathbed because of incurable cancer, and he says, I'm not going to suffer till the end. I want to end my life. I don't think that can get classified as suicide. Yeah. So,
he's talking of a situation in which there is no economic, social, personal, health, no issues, and people still exercise the choice.
In a way,
so
that I want to die, and you know, whether your country is progressive enough to say, yes, I accept it. That, you know, you.
My point is very simple to your answer. To answer your question, it's very simple. That yes, I accept the notion of choice as long as choice available to be exercised, that's all. I mean, if choice is available to be exercised, yes, I have. But when choice is not available, then to call it choice, you know what I mean? Like that, that's a spurious choice, is all my point was.
Sir, as you said, like for depression, there is no chemical imbalance evidence, but I want to know for other disorders, is there any chemical imbalance evidence for that?
For health conditions, I don't know of any of the mental health conditions where there are theories of chemical imbalance leading to mental health problems. But if you ask me, if you say, is there any conclusive evidence that it is a chemical disorder, there isn't any conclusive evidence. It's, you know, and then people say, oh, then why do you prescribe medication? Now, the reason you prescribe medication is because there is empirical evidence that medicines help people get better, okay? How those medicines work, we don't know. One of the theories is they work by making chemicals in your brain. That is how what we know. But the empirical evidence that if you take medicines, people feel better is not disputed by saying there is no proof, chemical evidence of chemical theory of depression or mental health conditions. You know what I'm making? I don't want the, you know, I think it's important to separate the narrative of things that work because you empirically observed them to work, saying that theories that you have to try and explain why those things work have no evidence. You know, they're two completely different things. I don't know if I'm being very clear on that.
And sir, one more thing, like in your book, what you just told about, it is more about not talking about counseling, not talking about medicines. So can I result with hypnotherapy where they don't listen to you, like they don't give you advices, neither they give you medications, but they still treat your problems by working on your subconscious mind?
You know, see, like I said, our interest in the book was not to deny the fact that there are mental health issues and those mental health issues need to be addressed. That's not, you know, we are not, you know, although people would like to call me, I'm not an anti-psychiatrist, although I wouldn't mind being kind of labeled as one. I am, okay, according to... we are not anti-psychiatry or anti-mental health or anti-counseling or anti-treatment. That's really not the issue. The point has been that we feel that the narrative has been too much about only mental health. The narrative has been like 100% about mental health. And we are saying, look, there is a need to shift the narrative and look at the evidence that actually there are many other issues which are far easier to tackle, which have disproportionate influence on why people die by suicide and which can have a disproportionate benefit in terms of reducing suicides. And let's talk about those also. While the narrative of mental health can remain, there are these other things which we just try to create space for a narrative which does not exist at the moment. The idea is not to say there is no mental, I mean, you know, we would be foolish to say there is no mental health problems at all. Of course, mental health is an issue, but less than 50% of people will have, or around 50% of people will have a mental illness. The remaining 50% of people don't have a mental illness. And even in the 50% of people who have a mental illness, there will be other distal causes which lead to that mental health problem. So if you address all of those, then yes, it's very important. So it's not to try and, I mean, I would be very sad if the message got out that, oh, we are like saying there is no mental health and suicide. Of course not, that's not the message. The message is to say, let's also focus on some equally important social issues that exist, you know. Is that...
yeah, and absolutely fair representation. And I just again want to reiterate what Soumitra said at the end. I mean, there's no intention of kind of saying that there are no mental health problems, either related to suicide or otherwise. I mean, we are in no way saying that there are mental health problems. Those need certain kinds of interventions. There is a role for counseling. There is a role for medications for some people for certain kind of mental health conditions. But this book is not about that. This book is absolutely not about that. This book is basically saying that there are multiple things that interact in terms of people ending their life by suicide. We have spoken enough about mental health problems. There are enough people speaking about mental health problems. Speaking more about it, or more people speaking about it, is not going to resolve the problems, because it has not resolved the problems over the years. So let's look at the other things that we have not looked at, which probably will help us reduce this problem. That's the only message out there. It's in no way negating the importance of mental health or mental health problems or interventions for mental health problems for that.
Hi.
Just a minute. One last question, unless... I've been talking a lot. So
My name is Aarti. I just wanted to know, in your research, have you found like how climate change affects the mental health or whatever? It may lead to economical disasters or whatever. And also wanted to know what is the Goa situation currently when it comes to suicides? What is the main trigger for the...
I'll answer the second question first. In terms of the rates, the situation in Goa has been, our rates have for many years now have been higher than the national average, and they have been going up over time. As with all of the other numbers in India related to suicides, these are going to be underestimates. So the actual numbers, for a range of reasons, as we have described in the book, are going to be higher than what we see in the NCRB numbers. So that's the first thing. In terms of what could be driving this, again, there's not rigorous research that has been done on this particular phenomenon in Goa, but there is no reason to believe why some of the other things in the rest of India that are kind of leading to suicide would be any different in Goa. Although we have kind of better socioeconomic indicators, etc., but those themselves bring a whole set of different problems which can lead to suicide. Couple of things that we have kind of looked at more peripherally one is alcohol consumption. The other one is domestic violence. I mean, but that's not to say that it's any different from other parts of India, but those are two very important issues that are related to suicide, which we have not been paying enough attention to. The other thing is also, I mean, the other social determinants that we spoke about, like education, etc. I think a couple of months ago, there was this newspaper article from Goa of some 5 and 7 year old kids playing, and then with a mobile phone, and one kid threw the mobile phone down, it broke. The 7-year-old kid got so scared about the implications of that, he or she, I don't remember now, went home and hanged themselves. That's beyond comprehension for me. I mean, that's nothing to do with mental health problems, but that's beyond comprehension. How does a 7-year-old understand that hanging themselves will end their lives and see it as an answer to that potential problem that they saw for themselves? So we see a lot of these stories in the media about young people killing themselves for a host of reasons which have nothing to do with mental health. But bottom line is we need to do more research in Goa if we need to understand some of this. And the other question about climate change, we have not done specific research around climate change in India. It's just something that's picking up across the rest of the world. But we can draw some parallels from what we are seeing from other parts of the world. So for example, if we look at farmer suicides, which result from crop failures, a lot of which is also going to increase because of climate change, right? So we can draw a kind of a bridge between climate change and crop failures. Yeah, and those are the other ones, but sorry? Yeah, current heat wave, etc. So farmer suicide specifically, because we are talking about suicide, we can clearly link with climate change and what we can predict could happen in the future if we don't kind of deal with it appropriately. But all of these other emergencies that Somit spoke about just now, floods, etc., and the heat waves, all of those are going to have an impact directly or indirectly on mental health. Some of which we have seen already. I mean, the tsunami, I mean, we have seen the effect of the tsunami on subsequent mental health in India, etc. So yeah, I mean, although we have not done research on it, it's something that's picking up, but there is no reason to believe why it would be any different in India in terms of the impact of climate change on mental health.
I was not going to answer your question directly, but on something that we've not discussed and which came up on Abhi's answer just now is the whole, how does a 7-year-old understand that suicide ends their lives and all of that stuff. And I think what we've not really discussed and brings home to us the need to discuss is the role of the media in suicides, now that's a huge another big thing in India. There's evidence, for example, there's good research evidence which says that a better media reporting of suicides or better media reporting of how people die could reduce suicides by anywhere by 1 to 2%. Now you'd probably say 1 to 2%, big deal. Well, when 250,000 people are dying each year, 1 to 2% is anywhere between 2.5 to 5,000 lives for zero cost. There's no cost involved. They just have to change their reporting style. That doesn't involve any extra money. So, no extra money spent and 5,000 lives saved seems to be good bang for the buck, and so that really requires media to change its way of how it reports on it. And we've recently seen the kind of tamasha that happened after a Bollywood actor died by suicide and how that did not help. And I'll give you a direct example of how it helps, how it works. If you remember this guy who died in America, the comic who died. No. Robin Williams. Robin Williams died of suicide many years ago, recently, and unusual method for dying. And I'm not going to. It was a very unusual method for his. In the 6 months after Robin Williams' death, the number of suicides using that method was up by 60%. Okay, so this notion of how media kind of people end up learning from it now, not directly but even indirectly, comes into play. And in India, I'll give you evidence from India because Lakshmi talks about it. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar is a psychiatrist. Lakshmi said that in the 90s she saw a lot of women dying by self-immolation, suicide. Very common in Tamil Nadu, she was seeing it. So she got after all the television serial people. She said it's very common in the Tamil serials that, something would happen, the women will go into the kitchen, pour kerosene on herself and set herself alight. It was something that many movies would show very clearly. And she got a few of the largest studios to agree that they would stop doing this anymore. The interesting thing is that self-immolation suicides in Tamil Nadu have dropped close to like not zero but suicides are no longer being glorified by the media sort of way. So these are simple things that we can be doing, which don't cost money very often, and I'm sure maybe Goa is a great place for ICG to be doing this, which is to get hold of Goa's media, the print media, the radio, so that Goa's at least the media in Goa starts to responsibly report on suicides, because when you have a high rate of suicides, then clearly you want to do every possible thing that does not cost money, do all of that, and even if that gives you a 1%, 2% benefit, then it's worth taking it,
What's interesting is that when you speak to journalists and reporters, they are very kind of supportive of all of this, and they say we do the right thing, but when it ends up on the editor's desk, they sensationalize it because that's what sells.
I'll tell you what, we've been trying to talk to editors, for example. What happens is that suicide beat, the crime beat reporter deals with the police tell them about suicide, so the crime beat reporter is writing about suicide. When you get the health journalist writing about suicide, they write much better. And what happens is when we do training programs for media, it's only the health journalists who come for it. The crime beat guys don't come for it. So really the challenge has been to talk with the newspaper owners and the newspaper editors to say, listen, one is shift your reporting from the crime guys to the health guys. And if you're not going to shift it, at least ensure that your crime guys are trained for it. I mean, one of the two things needs to happen.
Chaliye? Okay. Thank you, Sumitra. Thank you. Gosh, it's been Gosh, it's been a long session. I didn't realize what I was getting into, you know. First with the book, I thought, Hoga, you know, it'll be a good enough book to read and all that. And then I started reading and I said, no. This is very, very interesting. And then when I started doing the questions, it became even more interesting. And then after your answers, you get deeper into it. And then, you know, you guys got involved. So it turned out to be a fairly long session, I think about 2 hours. So let's all give ourselves a break. And thank you all for coming. And I think there's still maybe samosas outside because we made for plenty more people. So just check if there are samosas, you can even take them home. So that's it. And we should look into doing a program where we get the local media, television, as well as the print media involved, and
the Konkani film media.
Konkani film media as well. Okay, let's do something like this. Okay.